Welcome everyone to my tutorial dungeon where people get dragged in, sometimes for hours at a time, and they come out beaten and bruised and scarred. Nobody really knows what happens inside the dungeon, but when the people leave, they do happen to, other than the bruising, they do happen to know how to make this Pokemon Go or Yoshi egg, whatever you want to call it. So there are some pros, there are some cons, but if you do want to learn how to do this in Blender, you're gonna have to live through the consequences. I don't really know what I'm talking about. So yes, in this Blender tutorial, I want to talk about how to make this shot where not necessarily how to do the tracking and everything, but how to make the Yoshi egg in a completely procedural way where you can kind of see there's some cracks, there's these green dots that make it look like that iconic Nintendo style with some glow on the edges. And maybe if you guys like this egg tutorial, I can talk about how I put it in the hand over here, hovering and mutating, and then, thrown over here. Okay, enough of this intro. Wow, that's something. Let me show you how to make this in Blender. So I'm using Blender version 2.9. You can use version 2.8 or 3.0 when that comes out in the future. For now, you can only use 2.9, let's say. And to make this egg, we're going to start off with some modeling. So let's delete the cube and replace it with something more egg-shaped, and you can kind of pick whatever you want here. Now, most reasonable people probably pick the sphere because it looks the most like an egg, but you could transform any object into any object. To make this more egg-shaped, I'm going to go into edit mode, but if I right now, start selecting vertices and moving them, right, not only is it not very smooth like an egg, but it only selects the ones in the front, and we want to select everything. To do this, go to wireframe mode, or you could just hit Z and then wireframe. I'm just going to select the top vertex, or you can select the top couple vertices. And again, you can't move it like this. What you want to do is enable proportional editing. Hotkey for this is O, and I believe smooth is fine, or inverse square is also fine. So let's see. We're just going to drag that up, and that actually makes a nice egg shape, or you could try again, inverse square. Makes a different kind of shape, but also pretty interesting. I think I'm going to go with inverse square for this one. I don't even know what I did for the original shot, but this is going to be fine. Okay, so already we have something more egg-shaped. It's not looking smooth, so let's make it smooth, and it's very faceted, meaning that you can see the edges here, here, here. Let's put a little makeup on that, as if we're going to Sephora or something. How do we do that? We can add in a subdivision surface, or by the way, hotkey, Control 2, adds a subdivision surface with level 2. I feel like this tutorial, forget the egg, I'm just going to teach you a bunch of hotkeys. Control 2, Shift A, O for proportional editing. This is crazy. Once you have your egg shape, the rest of this really is just material based, which is the nice thing, meaning it's all procedural and we can change the look, but as for modeling, you're pretty much done already. So congratulations, pat yourself on the back as we go to the shading workspace. And I think for this, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be sticking in Eevee, but then when it's time to do our renders, we're going to switch over to cycles. But this whole material should be compatible with both render engines since we're not using any weird nodes. So this will be our egg material, and dear goodness me, I forgot to save. So let's save this as garbage. Boom. Okay. So for this material, we are going to use the principled BSDF going to our material output, but the interesting thing is what happens before, right here, before we get to that BSDF. So we're going to put a bunch of nodes here, it's going to go to the BSDF, and then it's going to get outputted. That's our game plan. So let's start off by making this egg have our green or whatever colored dots. I wonder if Pokemon Go, I haven't played it recently, I wonder if they have different colored dots for different Pokemon. That'd be cool. What we do for this, a classic trick, is you add a Voronoi texture, and you're thinking, Voronoi texture, that's the thing you make shattered glass and fragments with. How do you turn this into dots? That's a good question. What we do is we use this distance function, and then you can either use something like a color ramp, which we can kind of up the contrast, which you can see kind of makes circles. And that's kind of a weird thing. If you don't know why this works, it's because Voronoi basically creates a fragmentation based on a bunch of dots distributed across the surface. So if we make this high contrast enough, we're going to be converging on those original points, making circles. You can either do that with all the math and nerd stuff, or even cooler, we're going to add in a math node, set this to greater than, and this will already give us kind of infinitely sharp contrast, where we can kind of control the size of these dots. And then the rest of this is just picking a look that you like. So for me, I'm going to take the scale way down so there's far fewer dots. Something like 2 or 1.5 is the kind of things I've been experimenting with maybe smaller circles, something like this. And then the final thing we need to talk about is how to not have intersecting dots. And quite frankly, I don't have a good tip for you there. What I like to do is I like to go to 4D. So now we also have this W slider, which you can think of as a seed. And then I just kind of drag this around until I find a look I like. So, I mean, you just got to kind of get lucky without the intersection stuff. So I'm just going to keep sliding this until we get a good looking seed where we have a good distribution of dots going everywhere. This is looking pretty grim right now. Hopefully we find a good seed. I think last time it was like 0.61 or something, the one I liked. There you go. It took a while, but I finally found a combination of seeds, scales, and thresholds that make a egg that kind of has dots in the places I want them without intersection. You can copy these settings if you want them. And now to make these dots the correct color, what I like to do, throw in a color ramp, which is going to take our greater than kind of thing, and let us change the color, which is pretty useful. So let's take the black, which is the color of these dots, and make them green or something like that. Kind of like a turquoisey. I haven't looked at the game recently. Probably something like this. And then for the white, since it's technically an egg, and eggs are, even when they're white eggs, they're, a bit yellow. We take the color, make it something like this, and take down the saturation to something like 0.1, just so there's a tiny bit of yellowing and it's not exactly white. You take this, you throw it into the BSDF for the base color, ba-boom. There we go. So now we have kind of like the base kind of thing for our egg. And again, since this thing's procedural, you could change it at any time, but this is the egg we're sticking with. Let's roll with it. So now the question is, now that we have kind of our base set up with the Voronoi texture and everything, how do we kind of make this look photorealistic? How do we add all these like details, micro displacements, whatever? Well, that's what I'm going to talk to you about. So first of all, eggs, if you look very closely, they are smooth, but you're going to see that there's a bit of like a bumpiness to it that is kind of like a very fine grain. So maybe we should start off by adding that. So I'm going to add in a noise texture and a bump. And the game plan here is the noise texture is going to give us the detail that we want, and the bump is going to convert this into a normal map that we're going to plug in here. That's the game plan. So first of all, let's make this very, very small, and we're probably going to make it substantially smaller than this. But you take the factor, plug it into the height, because this black and white map, this noise texture, is going to basically say how high and low do you want your bump to be. So it's going to be in height, and then that is converted into normal, which is plugged in here. Bada bing, bada boom, bada bang. Okay, so what do we got so far? We got this horrendous kind of like, imagine the chicken that poops this boy out. I do not envy that chicken. So what we need to do is you can either take down the strength, make that less intense, or first of all, I want to make this finer. So let's make that 300. So it's very, very small details. And then, since I don't want to actually change the strength of this, since we're going to be messing with this a bit later, what we can do is send this through some math operations. So it has its own personalized, strength controller. Right, so we can take this, make it smaller, and you can see each time we decrease this, it's going to get less and less intense. And honestly, we're probably going to have to get into quite a few decimal places. So something like that, just for that very, very fine detail. You're probably not going to see it if you're very zoomed out, but once you get close, it's there. And we could add a bit of detail here and a bit of roughness as well. Okay, so now our egg, I feel like that's a bit too weak though. Now our egg, boom, has this kind of roughness to it. And another thing that I don't think the Pokemon Go or Yoshi eggs have this, unless the shit's about to hatch. They have a bit of cracking at the top, at least in theory, is what I want to do. And to do the cracked egg, it's actually very easy, just like the circles were surprisingly easy. Again, we are going to use Voronoi texture, since it seems like it's going to solve any issue we ever run into. Distance function, we are going to change this to not look at F1, which means something, I don't even know what it means. We're going to change this to distance to edge, which is going to give us this very harsh map that basically outlines, at least it should outline, like the boundaries of these fragments is the idea. So distance to edge. And just like last time, we can make it a lot harsher with some greater than and make that very thin. So these are going to be the cracks to our egg, and the other Voronoi is going to be the dots to our egg. Okay, so what we can do is we can actually incorporate both the very fine noise that's very hard to see since I made it very dim, and the cracks. We can take both of these and incorporate them into the same bump map by adding. That means take one, take the other, combine them by adding these together. Let's see what that looks like. So now, once this processes, since Eevee seems to take its sweet time, it should have both the fine detail when we zoom in and obviously these cracks. For the cracks, I want them to be much thinner. So imagine that, or not imagine, that's a weird way to start the sentence. We're basically going to be using small numbers for a lot of stuff here. And just like last time, we can change this to 4D and just play around with the seed once this loads. So you could play around with different crack variations and different dot variations. So let's see. So you can have your egg have different like crack states. And also something that I thought was cool when I made this the first time, you take texture coordinates and separate them so that we only have the Z component. In other words, how high up we're going here. Look at the Z component, and that gives us this gradient. We can actually multiply these two ideas together, so the cracking increases as you get to the top of the egg, as if, you know, Yoshi's trying to escape at the top but wouldn't out the bottom, since that's what's touching the floor. It makes sense. It'd splatter if it was trying to get out through the floor. So I'm going to set this to multiply. So we're going to multiply the gradient and our crack texture, which looks something like this. And to make that much more intense, we add a map range node, which is basically just an all-in-one node to control the gradient that we have going on here without a bunch of math nodes. So I'm just going to increase this to make it dim and move this slider to have it only start at a certain point. You know, you could look around and see what this interval stuff means, but don't worry about it. This is a big number. This is a number slightly bigger than 0. And then to make this less linear, smoother step will create a very smooth gradient that right now is not strong enough. So I'm just going to move these sliders around. And let's see what that looks like once this processes. So this should just give us our normal map. Yeah, there you go, where the cracking only begins at a certain point. And now that we can see this, let's actually mess around with these values a bit more. So the cracking isn't too intense, something like that. And again, we can have it start at any height in our egg. And these are just very fine details that only the guy who's reading the table of contents and the letter from the author and all this acknowledgments, they're the people who are going to see this kind of detail, but it does look good. Okay. By the way, another thing you can do, I'm not going to do this since I didn't like the look of it, is for the base color, you could throw in a mix RGB, and we can mix it with the color black. So in other words, we're saying, dude, Eevee's taken forever. We mix it with the color black, in other words, saying we are going to take these and mix them together by some factor, and we want that factor to be something related to our cracks here. So we can say wherever there is a crack, make it darker. Now this isn't exactly the way you want to do it. Like, I don't think I'm setting it up correctly. In fact, it's inverted, which means I can just invert this, I believe. Yeah, so we invert it and then we make it like less intense, etc. So that you have like darker areas where the cracks are. So let me just show math, set it to add, and then dude, Eevee's killing me. I wonder if Cycles is faster, in fact. But you just add some like negative value, and it makes it less intense. And that's a thing you can do. I don't want to do it, so I'm not gonna. Let's see. Let's connect this back here. Okay, so where are we? We've created the base color. We've created the normal map, and then finally, I like to have a glow around it just to make it. I mean, it's not like photorealistic or anything, but it does give it a kind of interesting, kind of almost magical or important, or I don't know, Pokemon and Yoshis are magical. So that's probably why I liked it. So you take an emission. This is the glowing material. We mix these together, but we don't want to mix them everywhere. We want to mix them wherever we have Fresnel. And if you don't know what Fresnel is basically this thing that looks at your view vector and the angle of incidence and all this. Basically what it does is it highlights anything that isn't directly facing you. So this curvature kind of goes away from here, so it gets brighter, whereas this faces me directly, so it's pretty dark. And we can say wherever we want glowing is exactly where we want this white. So you connect it in as the factor. Probably going to have to flip these since I never pay attention to what should be on top and bottom. So let's just flip these and then make the glowing something that's like the same color, like green. And you can see that this adds quite a bit of like, I don't know, a little fantasy style element. And by messing with this IOR, you can say how much should it be on the rim, and it should be something like that. And then also you can mess with the strength of the emission to say, I want this strength, etc. So now to make this thing look better, let's open up cycles, which is going to give us all our path tracing, blah, blah, blah. Set this to GPU and put it on a plane, just so it has some light bounces to mess with. Let's move that down. So this is basically our initial setup, which I'm going to make a shadow catcher so that we don't see the actual thing. There we go. For the rest of this, what makes it look really good is a good lighting setup. I don't want to spend the time doing that. So the trick I like to do is I open up the world. For the background, I set up an HDRI, because then you never have to mess with the lighting yourself. The work's done for you, which is always a good thing. So film, transparent, gets rid of the background. And now we have this cool looking thing that, I don't know, it does its whole thing. By the way, the brighter the HDRI, the less you're going to see the glowing, because that brightness is going to be not as strong compared to the HDRI. So let me pick an interior one, actually. That's a bit dimmer, and you can see this. And then you can always, of course, bump up the strength of this. In fact, you can make it like very strong, but I'll go with something like that. And there you go. That's pretty much the Yoshi Pokemon egg in terms of just creating the shape and the texture. I guess I'll also talk about how to make it do that shaking thing, as if it's about to hatch, it's shaking from side to side and all that. Basically, it's just going to be some rotation with drivers or noise modifiers or something from the bottom being the pivot point. We'll talk about that. But this is the initial kind of just how I rendered the thing. The whole thing is procedural. Again, you can change the color right here to be any color egg. So you could have a blue Yoshi egg. I think that is a thing in the Nintendo games. You can, again, also mess around with the seed to get different variations of eggs, mess around with the cracks, etc. Okay, cool. So now how do we do that animation thing without all the motion tracking and whatever? How do we just make the egg kind of wobble around? To do that, we don't want to have this rotate from here, because it should be rotating from where it touches the ground. So in edit mode, what you do is you just select the bottom vertex, which I guess you can just go here, make this floor invisible, and then just select the bottom vertex. Shift S is going to open up this menu that tells us, we could put the cursor here, 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 whatever. Shift S, move the cursor to selected, in other words, to this vertex. So right now the 3D cursor is here, and then we're going to move the origin, which is the pivot point, to the 3D cursor. See, as far as I know, there's no easy way to move the origin directly. You move the 3D cursor as a placeholder. It's kind of an intermediary. Okay, so to do that, F3 to type it in, origin to 3D cursor, which moves it there, or you could do object, origin, and then same thing. But that means that now when we rotate this thing, it's going to be based, the rotation is going to be pivoted off of here. And then we just need to add a bit of animation. So you could either, again, if you want full control, you keyframe the rotation. You go a couple frames down, I keyframe, and then you can just keep doing this. Wouldn't recommend that. Instead, what we're going to do is only add a single keyframe so that when we go to the graph editor, it will have a bunch of rotation data. So again, if you do not have the keyframe, you're not going to have X, Y, Z rotation. And by the way, this corresponds exactly to X rotation, Y rotation, Z rotation. It's called Euler for a reason that we're not going to get into. There's quaternions, there's Euler, forget about it. So what I like to do is with our X rotation, you hit N for these properties. Modifiers, we're going to add in noise, which is basically going to create this animation for us, right? And then you could actually have an egg that is very spastic. It's just about to birth and needs to get out. So the egg's going crazy. Or maybe the baby's just listening to some really good music. It could be that too. You take the scale up to make that kind of smoother over time. So if this is an egg that's like, it's moving a bit, but not much. This already gives us kind of like the same animation you see in the Pokemon or Yoshi games. It's kind of chaotic and all that. And we can add a bit of depth, which you can kind of see is like resolution almost. Makes it look more like a mountain range. So right now it's smooth. You can add a depth of 1 just so you have some chaotic jerks every once in a while. So I recommend doing that. And then this scale slider is the kind of the magnitude or the scale of the rotation. So you can see it's just kind of like the magnitude. So it's not going to rotate as much, but it will still do it at the same frequency. Again, you can do the same thing on the Y. In fact, I do believe there's a way to copy. So let's see, you can copy this driver and then Y, you paste it. So now this is going to have the same thing, which isn't exactly what you want, because then it's going to combine X and Y to do everything diagonally at the same phase. So I just recommend moving this phase a bit so it's a bit different and maybe a bit of offset, just so it's a different thing than X and Y, so it's moving independently. And then I know what you're thinking, what about Z? Well, the thing about Z is if you picture us adding a bit of rotation, it wouldn't actually rotate like that. Let me show you what that would look like if we paste the driver. I guess we lost the driver. Let's copy it and then paste it. This will make it like kind of rotate, which is okay if we were to make the scale like incredibly small. So like, I don't know, 0.15, just so it does it very, very barely. You wouldn't expect this egg to rotate much. It kind of stays on the pivot and does some X and Y. If you want, you could add some rotation and make it crazy. I wouldn't recommend it. But if you have a bit, I think it's passable. So now you have this kind of system where you have this noise driving this animation. You don't have to deal with it yourself. Since everything was using generated coordinates or some kind of texture coordinate that sticks with it, the cracks move with this. It doesn't have any issue where it crosses in and out of cross sections and all this for the Voronoi. And then when you go to rendered mode, it actually looks very good. And that's kind of the cool thing about this. I mean, what you need to do is once you have this whole setup, you need to turn this into like a cooler looking shot, like something like this or some of the other shots that I'm sure I made. So far, I only made this one. But you can see, we kind of talked about everything. You have the cracks, you have the fine detail that you can't see because the thing's too far away. You have your dots, you're glowing, and then, of course, you're shaking on the X and Y. If anything, I wish I kind of went back here and added a bit more chaos. And maybe I will do that for the render I show at the end, but the rest of this really is just tracking and the hand and like removing tracker dots and everything. If you guys are interested, let me know. I could whip up a tutorial. I'll bring you back to the dungeon. You'll get a couple more lashes, but you'll I don't know what I'm talking about, dude. Anyways, I hope you learned something in this tutorial. I've gone back to the no webcam format just so I can spitball and not think too much about it. Anyways, if you enjoyed this tutorial and want to support this channel and have it keep making these excellent tutorials, Patreon is quite frankly the only way to do that. Patreon is a way to fund creators, YouTubers. I hate that word. It's a way to fund these tutorials, but of course you get stuff in return like Discord access, like exclusive tutorials that I do not post for free on YouTube. Also, stuff like behind the scenes, project files. Like I will upload this blend that we just made. I will upload it to the Patreon. So Patreon exists. Please check it out if you want to do that, get those things, and support these tutorials. Thank you to anybody who does that. You are single-handedly, well, with all the other patrons, keeping CG Matter in default cube afloat. Anyways, that's the tutorial. Hope you made an egg. See ya.